When we talk about incels, there's this automatic reaction in society to recoil, to judge, to dismiss. The word itself has become so loaded with negativity that most people don't even stop to ask what is really going on underneath. When people hear incel, they think of angry online communities, misogyny, bitterness, sometimes even violence. And yes, those things exist. But the mistake we make is assuming that's the whole story, that the label itself explains everything. It doesn't. In fact, the label incel is really just a surface expression of something much deeper happening in the minds and lives of a particular group of people. So why should we even care? Why not just say, well, these guys are toxic, they're hateful, better to leave them behind? Because when we do that, we miss the human reality. We miss the pain, the suffering, the alienation that actually created this identity in the first place. And when people feel alienated and unseen, they don't just disappear. They get worse. They spiral. They harden into the very caricature we fear. So if our goal is to create a healthier society, to reduce harm, to foster connection, then leaving incels behind is not just cruel, it's counterproductive. At its core, the incel phenomenon is about loneliness. It's about people who desperately want connection, love, intimacy, but who feel shut out, unwanted, invisible. The term incel literally means involuntary celibate. That's not just a meme, it's an expression of a felt reality. Imagine being someone who longs for connection, but year after year feels rejected. Imagine going through adolescence, early adulthood, watching your peers date, fall in love, post their happy relationships online, while you sit alone in your room, feeling like life passed you by. That does something to the mind. It creates despair. It creates resentment. And if you have nowhere safe to bring that pain, it metastasizes into the darker stuff we see online. But notice, it starts with pain. It starts with unmet needs. And that's why we shouldn't leave incels behind. Because if we actually care about mental health, if we actually care about healing, then we have to meet people where they are. Even if where they are is messy, even if it's uncomfortable. Now, I know some people will say, but incels are dangerous. They're misogynistic. They blame women. They spread toxic ideas. And yes, that's true for some. But think about how those beliefs form. Do people wake up one day at age 15 and say, I'm going to hate women now? No, that comes from somewhere. It comes from repeated experiences of rejection, humiliation, social failure, combined with a lack of emotional support and guidance. It comes from being hurt and then turning that hurt outward. And if we only see the outward expression, the anger, the toxicity, and we ignore the wound underneath, then we're never actually addressing the problem. It's a lot like looking at an infection. On the surface, you see pus, you see swelling, you see something ugly. But underneath, there's tissue that's damaged, vulnerable. If you just say, gross, I don't want to look at that, the infection doesn't go away, it spreads. But if you actually care for the wound, if you clean it, if you treat it, then healing becomes possible. The same is true for the human mind. And let's also acknowledge the cultural context here. We live in a world where men, especially young men, are often not given healthy tools to process their emotions. From a very young age, they hear, don't cry, don't be weak, man up. They're not taught how to handle rejection, how to deal with loneliness, how to build resilience in relationships. Instead, they're told to suppress. And when you suppress hurt long enough, it doesn't disappear. It turns into bitterness, anger, despair. So the incel identity isn't just about individual failings. It's about a culture that hasn't given boys and men the tools to navigate intimacy. Now, does that excuse toxic behavior? No, but it explains it. And explanation is crucial because without understanding, there's no path to change. If we just say, these guys are toxic, throw them away, then we're not solving anything. We're just reinforcing the very rejection and exclusion that got them here. It becomes a vicious cycle. They feel rejected, they lash out. Society rejects them more. They double down on resentment. The only way to break the cycle is to actually engage with the root problem, unmet needs for connection, validation and belonging. I want you to imagine a teenager. He's 15, awkward, struggling with acne, socially anxious. He watches other kids flirt, get girlfriends, post about their relationships, and he feels invisible. He tries to make a move once. Maybe he asks someone out, and he gets laughed at. That humiliation burns into his memory. He retreats. He spends more time online where he finds other people who feel the same way. At first, it feels like relief. Finally, a place where people get it. But over time, the echo chamber takes hold. Pain turns into ideology. Loneliness turns into women are shallow. Women only want bad boys. I'm doomed. And that belief system hardens not because he's inherently hateful, but because it gives structure to his pain. Now, if we leave that teenager behind, what happens? He grows up carrying that bitterness. His world shrinks. His social skills stagnate. His resentment deepens. And in some cases, yes, that can turn dangerous. But if instead we said, hey, we see your pain, we get that rejection hurts. We understand you feel invisible. Let's work with that. Then suddenly there's a chance for healing, because what most incels need is not condemnation. It's guidance, empathy, tools. And here's where the psychology gets interesting. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. When something painful happens, we automatically try to make sense of it. Why did she reject me? Why don't I have a girlfriend? Why am I alone? If you don't have healthy narratives available, your mind will latch on to unhealthy ones. I'm ugly. I'm worthless. Women are cruel. The world is against me. These beliefs aren't pulled out of thin air. They're attempts to answer real questions. But they're distorted because they come from pain. So when we say we shouldn't leave incels behind, what we're really saying is we need to offer better narratives. Narratives of growth, resilience, possibility. Narratives that say, yes, rejection hurts, but it doesn't define you. Yes, you're struggling now, but you can change. Yes, intimacy feels out of reach, but there are skills you can learn. And that requires compassion. Compassion doesn't mean condoning harmful behavior. It doesn't mean excusing violence. It means looking at someone's pain and saying, I see why you're hurting. I see why you're stuck. And I'm not going to abandon you. That's powerful because so much of the incel identity is rooted in feeling abandoned by society. If society doubles down on that abandonment, we only feed the problem. If instead we extend a hand, even just a little, we create the possibility of transformation. Another thing to understand is that incels are not a monolith. Some are angry and hostile, sure. But many are just quietly suffering, sitting alone in their bedrooms, feeling hopeless, scrolling through forums because they don't know where else to turn. Some are clinically depressed. Some are socially anxious. Some are on the autism spectrum and struggle with social cues. These are human beings with complex lives. To reduce them to a stereotype is not just unfair, it's inaccurate. And when we misdiagnose a problem, we can't solve it. So what would it look like to not leave incels behind? It would mean creating spaces where men can talk about rejection and loneliness without shame. It would mean teaching emotional resilience, social skills, communication. It would mean modeling healthy masculinity, not the hyper-macho, suppress your feelings version, but the kind that integrates strength with vulnerability. It would mean saying, you're not doomed, you're not broken, you're not irredeemable. You're a human being, and your struggles are valid. But they're also workable, because here is the truth. The vast majority of incels are not destined to stay incels forever. They're just stuck in a particular mental loop. They've drawn conclusions about themselves and about the world that feel permanent but aren't, with the right support. Many of them can and do grow out of it. They form relationships. They find love. They build lives. But that only happens if someone meets them where they are. If we abandon them, we trap them in the loop. And honestly, it's not just about incels. This is about how we treat suffering in general. When someone's pain expresses itself in ugly ways, do we cast them out, or do we try to help? When someone lashes out, do we only see the behavior, or do we look for the wound? If we want to live in a compassionate society, We have to be willing to see the humanity even in people we disagree with, even in people whose pain manifests destructively. That doesn't mean tolerating abuse. It means not dehumanizing the person behind it. So when I say we shouldn't leave incels behind, what I'm really saying is we shouldn't leave anyone behind. Everyone's mind, no matter how messy, no matter how angry, no matter how wounded, is still a human mind, and human minds can heal. But healing doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in connection. And if we deny connection to the very people who need it most, then we're not solving anything. We're just pushing the problem further into the shadows. If we really want to understand why we shouldn't leave incels behind, we have to spend some time unpacking the psychology of rejection. Rejection is one of the most painful experiences a human being can go through. Neuroscience has shown that when people experience social rejection, the same regions of the brain light up as when they experience physical pain. That means being excluded, being told you're unwanted, being laughed at, or even being ignored. These things literally hurt in the same way a punch hurts. The brain doesn't really distinguish between social pain and physical pain. And now imagine that happening not once, not twice, but over and over for years. That's the reality for many incels. Every time someone gets rejected, the mind tries to explain why, and those explanations can take different forms. For some people, rejection becomes, that person just wasn't right for me. I'll try again. For others, especially when rejection is repeated, the explanation becomes darker. Something is wrong with me. I'm ugly. I'm unworthy. Nobody will ever want me. That's not just an explanation. It's an identity. And once the mind adopts that identity, it starts filtering every experience through it. If someone doesn't text back, it's proof. If someone says no to a date, it's proof. If someone looks uninterested, it's proof. The identity reinforces itself. And the thing about identity is that it feels permanent. When you think, I'm not attractive, it feels like a fact, not just a thought. It feels like you're describing reality. But what's actually happening is your mind is trying to protect you from more pain. If you accept the belief, I'm doomed to be alone, then you don't have to risk putting yourself out there again. You don't have to face the uncertainty of trying. The belief is protective. But it's also suffocating. Because while it shields you from the pain of rejection, it also blocks you from the possibility of connection. That's why shame is such a powerful force in the incel experience. Shame is the emotion of, I am bad, I am unworthy, I am broken. It's not like guilt, which says, I did something bad. Shame attaches to the self. And when shame takes root, people stop reaching out because they don't believe they deserve connection. They stop trying because they believe they're doomed. And that withdrawal creates even more loneliness, which creates even more shame. It becomes a vicious spiral. This is why leaving incels behind doesn't work. Because the very thing they re-struggling with, rejection and shame, is exactly what society gives them when we dismiss them. We say, you're toxic, you're gross, you're pathetic. That's just more rejection, more shame. And instead of pulling them out of the spiral, it pushes them deeper in. So what would it look like to break the spiral? The first step is empathy. Empathy doesn't mean agreeing with toxic beliefs. It doesn't mean condoning misogyny. It means saying, I see that you're hurting. I understand that rejection is painful. I know loneliness is hard. That acknowledgement matters because for many of these men, no one has ever acknowledged their pain. When you feel invisible, being seen is healing. The second step is guidance. A lot of incels are stuck not because they're doomed, but because they lack skills. Social skills, emotional regulation, communication, resilience. These things aren't automatic. They have to be taught and practiced. But our culture doesn't really teach them. So many young men grow up learning math, science, history, but never learning how to handle a breakup, how to manage anxiety on a first date, how to cope with loneliness. Without those tools, it's easy to get stuck. And here's where community comes in. Humans are social creatures. We heal in groups. That's why therapy groups, peer support, mentorship, these things work. If you take someone who's isolated and put them in a community where they feel accepted, where they can practice vulnerability, where they can receive encouragement, their mind starts to shift. The belief, I'm doomed, starts to soften. The identity, I'm unworthy, starts to crack. They begin to see evidence that connection is possible. But notice, that requires engagement. It requires us not to abandon them, not to write them off as irredeemable. Because if the only communities that welcome incels are the toxic online forums, then of course they'll stay stuck there. If mainstream society rejects them, but the echo chamber says, we understand you, where do you think they'll go? That's why it's so important to create alternative spaces, healthier spaces where their pain can be acknowledged without being weaponized. Let's also talk about masculinity for a moment. A lot of incel suffering comes from the expectations placed on men. Society tells men that their value comes from success, strength, status, sexual conquest. If you don't measure up to that standard, the message is, you're not a real man. That pressure is brutal. And for men who struggle socially, that pressure turns into humiliation. They feel like they've failed not just at dating, but at being a man at all. Now, when society's definition of masculinity is so narrow, it leaves a lot of men behind. That's why part of the solution has to be redefining masculinity. Not in a way that erases strength or ambition, but in a way that integrates vulnerability, emotional intelligence, care. Men need to know that their worth is not dependent on whether they have a girlfriend at age 18 or whether they re 6 feet tall or whether they make 6 figures. Their worth is inherent. And when they start to internalize that, they can approach relationships from a place of confidence rather than desperation. Another layer here is trauma. Many incels carry unresolved trauma, whether it's bullying, neglect, or family dysfunction. Maybe they were mocked for their appearance growing up. Maybe they had parents who didn't model healthy relationships. Maybe they were emotionally neglected. Trauma wires the brain to expect rejection, to anticipate pain. So when they approach social situations, their nervous system is already on high alert. That anxiety makes it harder to connect, which leads to rejection, which reinforces the trauma. It's a feedback loop. Healing that requires more than just telling someone to get over it or just put yourself out there. It requires real trauma work. Learning how to regulate the nervous system, how to process old wounds, how to build safety in relationships. These are not skills people can just figure out on their own. They need help. They need models. They need safe environments. And here's where compassion becomes essential again. Because trauma survivors often carry immense shame. They already feel broken. If society adds to that shame by labeling them losers, creeps, or monsters, then they just sink further. But if someone says, hey, I get why you're scared, I get why this feels hard, you're not broken, you're just carrying old wounds, then suddenly there's room for healing. I also want to acknowledge that for many people, the word incel is scary. It's associated with violence. And yes, there have been cases where people in those communities committed horrific acts. We can't ignore that. But here's the thing. Most incels are not violent. Most are just sad, lonely, isolated. If we treat the entire group as dangerous, we actually increase the risk because we push them further into alienation. If instead we distinguish between harmful behavior and underlying pain, we can intervene before pain turns into something worse. And in fact, one of the best ways to reduce the risk of violence is to increase connection. Studies on radicalization show that people are less likely to engage in extremist behavior when they have strong social ties, when they feel valued, when they have hope. The same applies here. If we want to reduce harm, the answer is not abandonment. It's engagement.